Hello and welcome. My name is Colin Hennessy, and as Executive Director of UChicago Alumni, which represents the more than 180,000 University of Chicago alumni around the world, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Harper Lecture. Harper Lectures bring UChicago faculty to cities around the world to present their research. This spring, for the first time in the program's 41-year history, Harper Lectures are going virtual. And we're delighted that you are spending this hour with us today. Since moving the Harpers online, more than 8,000 alumni, parents, and friends have watched one of our lectures live, and over 106,000 have watched our first Harper lecture on our YouTube channel. We're grateful for your enthusiastic response and appreciate you spending time with us today. Now, before I begin, I have a few brief comments. There'll be 3 people speaking today. You'll hear my voice and our presenters. All participants will be muted. However, we would like you to participate by asking questions. To do that, type a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen during the talk. If you have issues with your audio, you may want to shut down programs running in the background or dial in from your telephone. We are recording today's lecture and we'll make it available on our Harper Lecture YouTube channel. Our presentation will last for about 60 minutes. Our faculty expert will speak, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. Sadia Sindhu is the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. She has served in a variety of strategic roles in the public and private sectors. Most recently, she was the Director of the University of Chicago's Civic Leadership Academy. In this role, she served as the lead strategist on all matters related to the execution, enhancement, and growth of the Civic Leadership Academy at the Harris School and across the university. Sadia, thank you for being with us and for introducing today's faculty expert.
Thank you, Colin. It's my pleasure to introduce Will Howell. Will is the director of the UChicago Center for Effective Government. He is a Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, chair of the Political Science Department, and co-host of a top political podcast called Not Another Politics Podcast. In more than 10 books and 50 articles, Will has written widely on separation of powers issues in American political institutions, especially the presidency. His books include Relic, How the Constitution Undermines Effective Government and Why We Need a More Powerful Presidency, The Wartime President, Effective Executive Influence and the Nationalizing Politics of Threat, and Power Without Persuasion, The Politics of Direct Presidential Action, among others. His next book, Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy, written with Terry Moe, will be released this summer. A few weeks ago, Will was elected to the American Academy of Sciences. Will, we're delighted to be speaking with you this evening.
Hi there. Well, thank you for that invitation, that introduction, and thank you all for coming and gathering for some discussion in this strange and troubling time. We're spread out all over the country, perhaps all over the globe, and I'm grateful for you taking some time for us to get together and to talk about the state of American politics amidst this pandemic, and to try to make sense of the role of government and the challenges to government that stand before us. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to share with you all. So there we are. The title for this presentation was focusing on the American presidency, and I'm going to have a lot to say about the American presidency. We're going to get there, but I want to kind of pan back more broadly with hopes that we might take stock of American politics and the state of American politics just now as the country struggles to meet this extraordinary threat. And what I'm going to do is ask that we reflect less on what the pandemic has caused. I mean, the pandemic matters. COVID-19 matters, obviously, for the disruptions and that it has caused to our politics. Obviously, much more generally, this is going to be a talk about politics. Ever since Charles Tilly rather famously noted that war makes the state, we've had a deep appreciation in political science and sociology for the effects that crises have on reconstituting the state. But I want us to reflect less on what the pandemic is doing to our politics and more on what it is revealing about our politics. It's too soon to say what it's doing. I'm looking forward to the articles and books that are going to be written that try to take stock of what's happened. But I think we can speak just now about what it's revealing in ways that are reasonably cogent. And I want us to do that together. And it reveals a variety of things, this pandemic does. The first is what I'm going to call democracy's vulnerabilities. So for those who seek cover in a crisis in order to push back against a democracy and to behave in ways that are decidedly anti-democratic, small d democratic, there's lots of activity for us to try to take stock of and make sense of, just as during times of crises, we saw this rather poignantly in the 1930s, that questions about the efficacy of democracy and the efficacy of the way we constitute ourselves politically are raised in rather profound ways. And so the vulnerabilities, the limits of democracies come into full view. And for those of you who want to hear more about this, I commend Daniel Allen's Berlin lectures, which are going to begin tomorrow, that are going to be running through the University of Chicago and that you can watch online. There are also, when we think about what the pandemic reveals, it reveals startling inequalities. This is something that we all face, but we don't face equally. Just as it reveals inequalities that are tied to issues involving race and class and status, those are a set of socio-demographic features. So too, do we see it, these things having kind of a political content to them, and that we need to make sense of them and reckon with them. But it also just now reveals the profound costs of political failure. What happens when we have a government that doesn't effectively meet the challenges put before us? And it's put those in rather stark relief, and that we as a country need to not just reckon with those and see those, but find ways to move forward. And to do that productively, I want to suggest that we're going to need to think seriously about institutional reform, which is going to be a governing theme of the talk that I want to share with you today. And so when we think about the source of political failure, right, where is the problem coming from? To some, maybe to many, the answer would appear obvious. It's our current president. That's the source of all the disruption and the setbacks and the costs that we're currently confronting. And we see this in headlines all over the place, such that the New York Times tells us, right, he could have seen what was coming behind Trump's failure on the virus. That's a recent headline. Washington Post, the moment when Trump's shtick finally failed. The Rolling Stone weighs in how the Trump administration failed to protect America. The Hill has come in as well, saying that COVID-19 testing failure falls primarily on the Trump administration. Politico and Vox have all come in with plenty of criticisms of their own. The Atlantic recently, and rather they cut right to the point. This is Trump's fault. CNN, Trump's disastrous response to COVID-19 demands investigation. Okay, so look, this storyline is being played out, and these critiques of our president are being played out every night on the evening news. But what I want to encourage us to do for at least this period of time is to try to think a little bit beyond Trump the individual, beyond Trump, an individual who is or is not meeting expectations we face, and to think a little bit more deeply about some enduring truths that we have to contend with. And the enduring truth that I want to suggest that we have to contend with is that our government, quite by design, does all sorts of things that are meant to impede, not to facilitate, but to impede problem solving. And by problem solving, I mean the efforts of a government to meet challenges that a public recognizes as the legitimate subject of public action. And so this is no easy matter, right? Problem solving is not easy work. I mean, the first thing to note when we think about what's been going on for the last several weeks, the last several months, is that the governance challenges associated with shuttering the economy are absolutely profound, right? I mean, what has happened is staggering, and it is not to be I mean, it's unprecedented what we've seen in shutting down an economy that was revving at high gear. But when we look forward to the coming weeks, I want to suggest that the challenges, the governance challenges associated with reopening not a national economy, but many, many, many local economies is altogether staggering. To do so responsibly is going to require public officials to adapt, to learn, to find ways to coordinate with one another, to try things out, and when they fail, to scale them back, to open up segments of the economy, and then only to close them later as a function of what we learn and changes in the pandemic itself. And these are all qualities that run, I want to suggest, in frankly rather short supply in our system of separated powers. These, the ability to adapt and learn and to coordinate in ways that are really responsible. And so one way to see this is that here is the mortalities by county as of May 6 in 2020 across the country. And what you see are startling geographic variability in terms of just the effects that COVID-19 is having on populations all across the country. There's not one singular effect geographically, just as when we think about opening the economy, local economies vary in really important ways, and the level of exposure of different kinds of people and different kinds of jobs is very, very different, and the level of wealth and vulnerability of different populations varies tremendously across the country. This is not, so therefore when we think about what does it mean to roll out a response and to steadily and responsibly reopen the economy, we have to account for this variability. And in some ways, our system of federalism, that is the recognition that we're going to need to divide authority between the federal government, state governments, and local governments, ought to be well suited to these challenges. So arguments on behalf of federalism often recognize the diversity of local conditions, right? That there's not sort of one solution that's going to work for all populations. And the value of experimentation, to the extent that we don't know the best way to open up an economy in the aftermath of something like this pandemic and all that it has brought upon us. Experimentation, the ability to try things out and to learn from those local experiments is an asset when we think about the values of federalism. And then also the challenges associated with representation, to the extent that there are trade-offs involved with weighing the costs and attending to the costs associated with public health on the one hand, versus on the other hand, the economic fallout of imposing the kinds of social distancing requirements that we have today, that there are trade-offs involved in this, that different populations, different constituencies are going to come to different answers quite legitimately about which trade-off that they want to weigh more relative to another. And that to the extent that a federalism allows for different populations, different local communities to weigh these things differently, then this would appear to be an asset. But there are two things that push back against these strengths of federalism. And the first is simply the lack of expertise. It's unreasonable to expect communities all across the country on their own to meet this challenge before them. That they need expertise, they need backing, they need support in order to responsibly and coherently attend to the challenges before them. And then there also are these externalities, which have to do with the decisions that any one local community makes have repercussions. They could be positive or negative for the most part. In this world, we're talking about negative repercussions for other communities. And if you're wondering sort of what is the image of externalities, well, there it is, right? This is Clearwater, Florida, the beaches of Clearwater, Florida on March 17th, 2020. I assure you, not all of those people in this picture are from Clearwater, Florida. They came to vacation for a bit and then they returned to their home communities. And you know the concern. The concern is that then some of them may have brought the virus with them. And so the decisions that the local government officials in Clearwater, Florida made about keeping the beaches open in mid-March had implications for the rest of the country. And so it is with all communities. I don't mean to single out Clearwater, Florida as the boogeyman here. This is about externalities that are shared more broadly. And so in some ways, what you might say is, well, there is the role for the federal government, and in particular, the federal bureaucracy, right? The federal bureaucracy ought to step forward and offer a measure of coordination and expertise to attend to these two needs that we've identified as it relates to federalism. But what I want to suggest is that neither of these are assured. You can't count on them. Why is that? Well, the first is that the federal bureaucracy has ample coordination problems of its own, right? The idea that it is a single entity that can speak coherently and direct different communities to behave one way or another in light of the latest findings as to that relate to the rollout of the pandemic, or in order to inform different communities about the decisions of other communities and to take the necessary precautions in order to ensure that they're not adversely affected. And so one way to see that is that this is the appendix of Appendix 2 of a Department of Homeland Security report that was issued in 2017 that identified the agencies that were played a role, the departments and agencies and offices that were going to play a role in the response and recovery of a biological incident, very much including a pandemic of the sort that COVID-19 represents and presents. And what you see is there are a whole lot of departments and a whole lot of agencies here. They're all over the place, right? They're in multiple departments. You've got Department of Health, HHS here. You've got Department of Transportation. You've got Department of Interior. It goes on and on. Department of Commerce. Individual agencies all over the place here that have a role to play in attending to a biological incident. And this just has to do with the role in the response and recovery of an outbreak. Never mind the extraordinary challenges presented with, again, reopening an economy in the aftermath of a pandemic. And so the idea that they are going to sort of cohere as a single entity and speak coherently and harmonize with one another is, I'd like to suggest, to ask too much and to expect too much, given the design of the federal bureaucracy that we have. And then we turn to expertise, and we want to think about, well, where does expertise come from? Expertise is not handed down from on high. Expertise in the administrative state is something that has to be cultivated. It has to be resourced. And there are things that we can do that mitigate, that marginalize, that undermine expertise. And one thing that political scientists have done a lot of work studying is the trade-offs associated with political appointments and the ways in which the introduction of political appointments, while giving presidents a measure of control over administrative agencies, comes at the cost of those agencies' kind of neutral competence, the expertise that they invest in, that they develop, the willingness of experts to stay in the public sector, the ability of federal agencies and departments to attract experts into their ranks are all, political scientists have shown, mitigated, undermined by the introduction of greater numbers of political appointees within their ranks. And so this is, here we've got, in this figure, we've got two countries that, by way of comparison, the United Kingdom and Germany, and the number of political appointees in their federal bureaucracy. And when you do population adjustment for these two, they're roughly comparable between the UK and Germany there. And if you look, if you were to sort of expand these countries and do it on a per capita basis to the size of the United States, you would roughly triple the size of these numbers. And so you would get up to about 400 political appointees within these two countries that have robust, independent, strong bureaucracies that people broadly recognize as including large numbers of experts. Here's the number of political appointees that we have within the United States. In just the federal bureaucracy, right? It carries us north of 4,000. We are a huge outlier when you think about the number of the politicization of the bureaucracy relative to other advanced industrialized democracies. And so here's another concern about the number of political appointees. And then moreover, we have increasingly, and particularly over the last several years, what I'm calling here a hollowed out bureaucracy. lots of the presidential appointments required Senate confirmation right now consist of either interim appointees, individuals who are not appointed on a permanent basis, and therefore their ability to work, to perform their duties is in important ways compromised, or they just simply sit empty. And this comes from work by a political scientist at Yale, Christina Kinane, who's doing some terrific work on the number and the variation in the number of interim appointees and the number of empty seats across the federal bureaucracy. And what you can see here, these are broken out by each of the agencies. This is as of January 30th, 2020. You see that roughly 60% of presidential appointments requiring Senate confirmation are serving on strictly an interim basis within Homeland Security, which was the very department that issued that previous report that we just took a look at. And you see across lots of agencies, large numbers of seats that are simply empty, like in labor, it's roughly 30% are just sitting empty. In Treasury, 42% are sitting empty. And so to the extent that you're concerned, I mean, this raises big concerns about competence and expertise and the ability of agencies, the federal bureaucracy, simply to perform the kind of function and attend to the expectations that we might have of them. So moving on, what about Congress? Let's think about the first branch of government for just a moment and its capacity to address pressing problems. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that Congress, as a collective decision-making body, is characterized by these three features: that legislators who hope to hold their seats in office and hope to thrive politically have powerful incentives to behave in ways that are decidedly parochial. That is, they need to routinely look over their shoulder and think about the effects that policy are going to have on their districts or states back home, first and foremost. Right? They want to think, when we think about comprehensive reform, what does it mean, not for the country as a whole, what does it mean for the people of the 1st District of Illinois or the 3rd District of Florida? That again and again, they understand and evaluate policy in ways that are decidedly parochial, just as they pay a whole lot of attention to the here and now. The question is, how does policy change? What repercussions does policy change have for my constituents now? And that these features lead to a kind of piecemeal and haphazard change. When we think about the capacity of, again, the first branch of government to attend to big challenges, you're going to have 435 voting members of the House, each a political entrepreneur unto herself, each trying to attend to the best interests of her local district and the short-term concerns that she may bring to bear, pushing for the sliver of a policy change that will directly impact organized interest within their the jurisdictions that hold their political fortunes and their ability to retain office in judgment. And so what does this mean? Well, what does this mean right now is when we look at this, is these stimulus packages that we're acting upon that are coming through Congress right now. And we're spending trillions and counting. There's a widespread recognition that what's been done thus far is inadequate and that more will need to be spent. This is extraordinary, right? And in important ways, the money that is being spent is decidedly attending to very real needs. I don't want to discount this, that there is a public purpose being served by this action, but it's being served by a collective decision-making body that is ripe for all kinds of special interest influence. And so what I have here is a quote from the lobbyist and tax counsel at the National Retail Federation, who said, right, we went to McConnell's people, we went to Schumer's people and Pelosi's and McCarthy's people, and we pinged them all. And what I want to suggest is that in this spending bonanza that's happening right now within Congress, she's hardly alone. That physicians groups and makers of non-prescription drugs secured the provision of an increase in the FDA's review process of over-the-counter drugs and sunscreen products. This is a part of these efforts by Congress that are meant to revive our economy that are happening right now. There was a 6-month extension of federal funding for abstinence-only education programs that was a product of intense lobbying. That the farm subsidies have increased by $24 billion under these bills. And it isn't just about the influence of outside organized interests. It also is about political entrepreneurs and senators and legislators themselves attending to their local constituents. And so Senator Leahy from Vermont, which is a population, it says here, at 625,000, roughly a quarter the size of the city of Chicago, ensured that of the $150 billion slush fund that was set aside for state and local governments, fully no state would receive any less than $1.5 billion. And so you see a gross overrepresentation of the residents of Vermont just on a per capita basis in terms of their claims to these particular funds. And that's in no small part because of the design of the Senate and the fact that Vermont, population 625,000, has 2 senators, as does the state of New York or California. And so here, as in all matters of politics, residents from small states are disproportionately represented in their claims for federal largesse. And here we have only $250 million, or less than 0.01% of the $2.3 trillion in this bill allocated to oversight. This is just on a dollar-by-dollar basis, significantly less than the oversight afforded to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which was roughly a quarter of size in terms of its magnitude. Okay, so there's your Congress, right? And then the question is, what about parties? Right? Maybe parties can step in and offer a measure of discipline to our politics in ways that kind of bridge division across the various branches of government and allow for a measure of coordination among individuals who occupy different stations of government. And here, this is a figure that's going to be perfectly familiar to the political scientists who are watching. It just tracks the level of polarization between the two parties over time. So the y-axis here is a measure of the ideological, the sort of a summary measure of the ideological voting behavior of members of Congress. And in blue, I've identified the Democrats, and in red, I've identified the Republicans from 1945 to 2020. And that time is the x-axis here. And that you see the blue kind of shaded area identifies the range for each year between the most liberal and the most conservative Democrat, and the red for each area identifies the most liberal and the most conservative Democrat among Republicans. And higher values on the y-axis identify people who are more conservative, and lower values on the y-axis identify individuals who are more liberal. And so what you see, as one would expect, Democrats reside below Republicans. They are much more liberal. And the solid lines identify the median legislature, the median Democrat and the median Republican for each Congress from 1945 to 2020 over time. And what you can see here, right, is that the distance between those two lines, particularly since the mid-1970s on, is increasing rather dramatically. That the parties are becoming more polarized. Just as you can see that for the earlier period, there's a fair amount of overlap. That is, instances where Democrats and Republicans in their voting behavior look just as liberal or conservative as one another, until about 2000, when there's a perfect sorting between Democrats and Republicans, and there's no overlap whatsoever, right? And so to the extent that polarization impedes political opportunities for political cooperation, it can represent challenges to problem solving. Here, the fact that the parties are at historically high levels of polarization is cause for real concern. And then on top of that, I simply want to recognize that the current state of the Republican Party represents additional concerns. That the shift that we saw between the two parties was not symmetric. That there's a slight shift in the liberal direction from the early 1970s on among Democrats, but there's a marked shift in the conservative direction among Republicans. And that Republicans, particularly over the last 3 years, have become the voice and home of populism. And this is something that we can talk about in the question and answer period. But to my mind, populism is not just about channeling kind of the will of the people and the forgotten true Americans who can finally reclaim their government. In important ways, populism represents a threat to democracy. It represents a threat to problem solving, insofar as populism presents a deep critique of the political order. It stands in opposition to a political order, and it assumes a posture that is not just offering a kind of a constructive critique in the service of improvements, but one of continual opposition. And that this makes it all the more difficult to think about long-term concerted problem solving when it comes to leveraging the kinds of power that the president has, the public has, the American government has in the service of solving public problems. So there are parties and words about parties, and then there's the larger public itself. And no surprise, its level of trust in government, I misspelled government here. In any case, so its trust in government and its ability to handle domestic problems has increased dramatically since the early 1970s, just as the parties are becoming more polarized, such that around 1972, about 70% of the public said that they either had a great deal or a fair amount of trust and confidence that our federal government in Washington, when it comes to handling domestic problems, and that this has steadily declined. The question wasn't asked between 1976 and 1997, but you could see it steadily declining over the last 20 some years. Okay, so the president, let me say a few words about the president, which is that presidents in this space offer the possibility of a kind of leadership that we sorely need. Because unlike members of Congress, presidents have a national outlook that they, not perfectly, but better than any single elected individual, represent the country as a whole. And therefore, when they think about how to attend to national problems, which this pandemic decidedly is, they tend to think about coherently about the whole. They're not making arguments on behalf of one particular local constituency or another in the way that legislators reliably do. They think about the whole. They have a longer time horizon. To presidency scholars, when we think about what motivates presidency scholars, if legislators are single-minded seekers of re-election, well, presidents, they think about their legacy. They play to the ages. And they think about how do we attend to problems over the long haul. And because of these two things, thinking about the nation as a whole and thinking about the longer haul, they often reflect upon the coherence of policy and of policy making. And it's not a coincidence that presidents, the sort of efforts at good government often emanate from presidential initiatives. And that presidents, as a result, and this is something I've written on at some length in the last book I wrote with Terry and called Relic, and in the forthcoming book that's coming out, they've been stewards of effective government. This isn't to say that they get it right all the time. It isn't to say that they can't make catastrophic mistakes. Of course they can. But they think about effective government in ways that legislators do not as much. So then the question is, do we have a president who's up to the task and a presidency that's up to the task? And the answer to at least one of these questions is no. And I'm going to focus on the latter, which is that the presidency that we have tonight, the presidency as an office that we have today is overpowered in important respects, is given powers that frankly should be scaled back. Its ability to politicize appointments, this is what we referred to earlier on, or its ability to politicize the Justice Department in particular, or its exercise of unilateral powers, and its ability to pardon. There's strong arguments, and I'll be happy to address any of them in the Q&A period. There's strong arguments for scaling back these powers that are given to the presidency. But others ought to be enhanced. And in particular, the president's agenda-setting authority in the legislative process. There's an important role for presidents to play in setting a national agenda, saying, Congress, here's what you need to focus on, right? You don't need to side with me, but you have to deal with this particular policy on my terms in order to kind of breathe life into the legislative process and to discipline the parochial short-term tendencies that predominate within it. And so the relevant question I want to suggest is that not whether or not our president is too weak or too strong, but rather whether we have a presidency and with it a political system that can reliably deliver the kind of leadership we need to address modern problems. It's today and right now we are up to our eyeballs in concerns about COVID-19. But tomorrow there will be additional pandemics, there are concerns about climate change, and rising inequality, immigration, massive debt, an incoherent tax code, and on, that we need to find responsible ways of leveraging presidential leadership in the service of more effective government. And this is the work that lies ahead. And it's on this that I'm going to end, which is that if we're going to get serious about the kinds of threats that this pandemic presents, we had better get to work on institutional reform in the service of a more effective government. These are themes that we talk about, Terry Moe and I, in our forthcoming book, which the University of Chicago Press is going to be publishing, which will be releasing in a month or so from now, called President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy. And they're concerns that I hope will animate public discussions more broadly. So let me end there and welcome feedback, questions, and we can have some exchange.
Thank you, Will. So why don't we start off with a question that came from the UChicago DC Alumni Club. They are asking about your wallpaper and whether or not those are pineapples or monkeys.
Oh, it's a great question. These are neither. They're tigers. They are tigers behind me. But I have pineapple wallpaper up in my hall, and anybody who from the DC Alumni Club who finds their way into Chicago, I'd be happy to show it to them.
Lovely. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, here's a question that has come in different forms throughout the Q&A, and this comes from Omar. This fall, we have a presidential election, which will give the American people an opportunity to render their verdict on the current administration and offer a corrective if they so choose. Why isn't that enough? Why, in your view, do we need to reform our institutions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Elections are hugely consequential, and this election matters a ton. And I think it's the fact that this president occupies this office is of great consequence for our ability to meet this pandemic and to meet the public challenges that stand before this country. And a real choice decidedly will be put before this country. But whoever wins is going to inherit a set of institutions not of his making, and they're institutions that make problem solving incredibly difficult. And if we're going to get serious about meeting the challenges of climate change, if we're going to get serious about meeting the challenges of the next pandemic, we better think hard about investing in expertise and shoring up a federal bureaucracy and allowing for and contemplating revisions to the legislative process that allow for meaningful action to meet these public problems. And that's the work of institutional change. This is not a story about if we could swap out the bad guys who occupy office today and put in good guys, then all would be set right. In important ways, for whomever occupies the office, our government, quite by design, and in some ways for very good reasons, frustrates ambitions, but it also derails efforts in ways that can be profoundly counterproductive to problem solving. And that's what we need to get serious about.
Thank you. Here's another question. So if things are as bad as you say they are, and the Trump administration is as culpable as those headlines you presented towards the beginning of your slides, why should we do anything to rehabilitate the presidency? Why shouldn't we set our sights on other political institutions, say Congress or state or local governments?
Yeah, so there's a reason why I wanted to spend some time talking about the political system as a whole, because I think that there are important reforms to consider throughout the political system. But the presidency historically has played a hugely important role in, not just for the power that it wields, but it's in efforts to solve public problems in order to address long-term challenges that the country faces. And we need to find ways of leveraging the unique kind of leadership that we can find therein. And so if you are listening to this and you say, my God, no, all our problems start and end with Donald Trump, and all we need to do is get him out of the way, and that every time Trump experiences a setback is a victory for democracy, and there's reason then to hold out hope that we're going to end out okay. I want to suggest that that's short-sighted in its thinking, because Trump is not going to occupy this office forever. And we need presidential leadership for the particular kind of outlook that presidents stand to offer, the kind of expansive view of the needs of the country as a whole, the kind of coherence that they can offer and the guide that they can offer in directing goings on within this sprawling bureaucracy that is in no small part the product of legislative deliberation. And so we need to find ways to responsibly leverage the presidency. And that means in some ways cutting back powers that are given to it. Because when a demagogue occupies the office, real damage can be done, which is why I wanted to identify certain areas, right? The pardon power, to my mind, and we again lay this out in the book, it has no role to play in the White House. There may be arguments on behalf of granting some extrajudicial authority to a body that would revisit sentences that have previously been handed down. Why this is given to the president when is not clear to me at all when we think about effective government. So we ought to scale that back. And so too with a number of other powers. But we also ought to find ways to more responsibly leverage the kind of perspective that presidents stand to offer our politics. Not reasoning from the individual who occupies it, but reasoning from the institution and the position that that individual occupies within our polity.
So here's the question. This came in from Jeff. In many crisis periods like wars or pandemics, there's usually a consolidation of power in the executive branch. We've seen President Trump defer to state governors, regardless of his rhetoric, on opening the economy. Governors have been really prominent during this crisis, or so it seems.
Yeah.
Is there a precedent that's being set here? And if so, is it a good precedent based on how we see things rolling out?
It's another good question. To my mind, no. So this is sort of making sense of politics in real time. To my mind, no. What we're observing are just frankly, a handful of Democrats and maybe a couple of Republican governors stepping forward and offering kind of really directed leadership in meeting this pandemic. And they're doing so in no small part because they're filling a void that historically crises of the type that this pandemic presents are opportunities for presidents to shine, to step forward and to become the kind of focal point of our attention. It's to presidents during times of crisis, during times of war, that we turn for consolation and a sense of meaning and direction. And we aren't doing that. We aren't getting that from this president. So here, this is a little bit of politics I'm introducing now to my mind. What we're not observing is consistent truth-telling from an empathic president who is trying to speak in ways that directly to the fears and concerns of average citizens. We're not getting that. And so that's opened up space for governors to step in. But it's also a space that's going to be available to the next president who faces a crisis. And so I don't think we're seeing some structural change to our federalist system so much as we're seeing some individual governors filling a vacuum.
So we're up to 231 questions, so I'm going to try my best to get them to you.
I better go more quickly than I am.
So this comes in from George. George asks, in the private sector, you have companies that fail at being efficient and effective, and those that do well prosper. The federal government doesn't have incentives that are driving greater productivity. How can we create a federal government that has the proper incentives to innovate and become more organizationally sound?
Yeah, look, there are lots of reasons why public agencies that are given public authority, that are beholden to a public, don't behave in ways that mirror the kind of efficiency that we imagine corporations having, that are ultimately held responsible to a bottom line. So the notion goes. So the answer is there are lots of reasons. But I share this underlying concern, which is to say that isn't to say that we can't do better, that we can't think about ways of making targeted, meaningful investments in expertise, in experts, to improve lines of communication, to ensure that the only agenda setter within Congress isn't a party leader, but they may represent somebody like a president who represents the country as a whole. These kinds of things, we need to be thinking seriously about how do we reconstitute our political institutions in the service of effective government. There are lots of other criteria we can bring to bear in evaluating government performance. I really want to drive home this need for effective government.
When you think about governments that have responded well, this question comes in from Nitin. Can you give examples either locally? We've talked a little bit about governors, but perhaps looking abroad with countries that have, and democracies in particular, that have responded well to this pandemic.
Yeah, so I can do that, but as soon as I do it, I'm gonna get into trouble, both because it's gonna push me outwards past the boundaries of my own expertise, one, and two, I think it's right now isn't the time to make sense of who's doing well and who's doing poorly. We don't, the short answer is we don't know. This is a live issue. It's unfolding in ways that are rapid and unpredictable, and there's a lot of work that's going to need to be done, and it's really important that we do this work to trace differences in outcomes across different countries to different designs of the political institutions themselves, right? Is it about the independence of the bureaucracy, or is it about, you know, which party is in control, or is it about the strength and the health of a healthcare system, right? There's a ton of work that needs to be done before we start, you know, grading countries or individual governments to figure out who did well and who did poorly and to what we want to attribute their performance. But that work is hugely important. Right now, I think what we can do is recognize the stakes involved. I don't know what the answers are exactly, what you know what the fallout is, but there are huge stakes involved associated with ineffective government, a government that can't meet public problems, and that's what's been put in stark relief.
When we talk about ineffective government, can you speak to whether or not we have any sense of what definitively, like, how many lives have, like, what has contributed to the loss of life in this pandemic? What has been the cost of what you talk at great length about ineffective government and our response?
Yeah, so I'm going to deliberately speak in generalities here because, again, we have a lot to learn in this space. And we're going to learn in the months and years ahead about these costs. But the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic is not just a public health problem. It's a challenge to a polity to figure out how to organize itself and how to meet a public challenge, right? Which is about testing. It's about enforcement of social distancing requirements. It's about coordination of scarce resources. It's about hospitals that are overrun. It's about sharing ventilators. This is about government. This is about thinking about the government. I mean, it's not just about the government, but the government plays a huge role in figuring in meeting these particular kinds of challenges. And so that's why I say I don't know what the marginal effect would be of a slightly more independent federal bureaucracy on the number of lives lost. I don't know the answer to that. We don't know the answer to that. But I think it is clear that a government that can't effectively govern is going to lead, in midst of a pandemic, to an excessive loss of life.
Well, you've talked quite a bit in your books and in your writings about the enhancement of agenda setting. Dimitri asks, what does that look like? And what does it look like if the legislature doesn't focus on the agenda the president sets?
So we lay out the particular reform. Meaning my co-author Terry Moe from the Hoover Institution and Stanford University. He and we lay out the proposed reform at some length and relic, and we revisit it again in this forthcoming book. And what it basically looks like is fast-track authority in domains outside of trade. That is, the president would have the opportunity to introduce a bill before Congress that Congress would have to vote on within a certain period of time. And so legislators wouldn't be afforded the opportunity to simply ignore a proposal without consequence, because if they ignore it after a specified period of time, it automatically becomes law. And so to the extent that presidents provide a different kind of leadership, a different kind of perspective, again, not reasoning from Trump or Obama, or whoever your most favorite or least favorite president is, reasoning from the institutional design of the office, whoever whatever proposal is put forward, then requires legislative consideration and a vote. And that will amplify the kinds of concerns that are national and long-term that emanate more reliably from the presidency than they circulate among Congress, within Congress.
We're now up to 270 questions.
Oh my God,
steadily
I'm going
increase.
too long.
So this comes in from Julia. Julia asks, the expansion of presidential power presumably happens over time. Can it be contracted quickly?
No. Can it be contracted quickly? No. I mean, I think I mean, we've seen ways in which wars contribute to the expansion of presidential powers. We've seen ways in which Congress willingly has delegated all kinds of authority to the president. But this is something I'm teaching the American presidency right now. This is a theme we talk about, the accretion of executive authority over time, and presidents who, because they are expected to do way more than their formal powers allow them to do, they hold on to whatever authority they can get a hold of, and they don't give it up without all kinds of resistance. And Congress, for institutional reasons of its own, is poorly equipped to stand up for its own institutional prerogatives. So what does that mean? It means you give something to the president, it's hard to take it back. So no, can there be a quick corrective? No, this is hard work. I mean, this is hard work in institutional reform more generally. It's hard work, but there are huge payoffs. Sorry, I'm going on too long again, Sadia, but I want to do it one more time, right? Which is to say, when you think about why aren't we meeting the threat of climate change in a serious-minded way with our national government, it's not just a function of the policy commitments of the people who occupy the office. It's because it's a huge governance challenge. And if you want to get serious about meeting that kind of challenge that's going to play out over decades to come, we better think about institutional reform. We better figure out ways to train people's attention on the problem itself and to leverage the expertise that's available and embedded within the bureaucracy and put it to good use. Because right now we don't do that.
On that note, Chelsea asks, so the culture of an agency, indeed even of the presidency, influences how decisions are made. How do we foster a culture of considering evidence as basis for decisions? How do we have the administration look to expertise as it makes its decisions?
There's no one answer to this. What I want to suggest two things, right? One is to refer back to this trade-off between politicization and expertise, right? That the more you politicize an agency, the more political appointments you make, the more you marginalize experts. This isn't me making this up. There's been a tremendous amount of research on this topic. And so you can think about trade-offs there. And then the follow-on is that when we think about institutional reform, that has implications for culture, it has implications for discourse, it has implications for the public debates and the hard debates that we need to have about these challenging problems. So I don't want to suggest that institutional reform is just about kind of rules and procedures, and if we just get that right, it's the value of doing this kind of work is also to be found in what it sets in motion. We start having different kinds of conversations, and different kinds of standards are brought to bear when we evaluate policy alternatives that are put before us as we change these rules, as we change these procedures.
Well, we've talked a little bit about agenda setting. Miranda writes, what are some other specific suggestions you have that can make our presidency more effective as an institution?
So we lay them out in chapter 4 of the book, right? So it's all in the book. It's coming out in like 6 weeks or so, and I think you can get it now if you're interested. You can pre-order them. Let me give one. And this has, so the agenda setting has an expansion of presidential power. There's another thing which has to do with the emergency powers that are given to the president. Right now, whether we're in a time of emergency or not has real implications for presidential discretion. And we live in a world in which the president can decide on his own. It's a time of emergency, and therefore I'm going to claim all kinds of powers to reallocate funds that were once meant to be spent on one thing in the service of something altogether different. And this is how Trump has redirected all kinds of funds to build the wall on the southern border in the face of widespread opposition within Congress and not a whole lot of support within the American public more generally. This is like ripe for serious-minded reform because it's a kind of power that's been given to the president in ways that are excessive and are not disciplined, and that can be very dangerous when you have somebody who is not Democrat, right? Is not a Democrat, small d Democrat, right? or who is a demagogue, or who is a populist. This can be profoundly counterproductive in the service of effective government.
Okay, well, last question. This comes from
Okay.
Jennifer. What role can universities play in filling the leadership and expertise voids in our government today?
I love this question to end on too. Thank you, Jennifer. So they play a huge role. So when I think about what does a movement for effective government look like, it requires lots of hard conversation and bringing lots of parties together to figure out how do we, I've studied the presidency for the last 20 years. Terry and I have done a lot of work in this particular domain, so we have a lot to say about presidents, but there's work to be done all the way through the political system. And so universities have a hugely important role. And if I could put in a plug for our own initiative, Sadia, right? This Center for Effective Government, this is an effort on our part to open up a space in our politics that tries to take seriously the possibilities of institutional reform in the service of a government that can actually solve problems that stand before us. What kinds of reforms do we need in order to meet the profound challenges that stand before us? Universities play a huge role. So do journalists, right? So do scholars. So do advocacy groups. How do we harness these energies and these different kinds of expertise in the service of a movement for effective government? We need to get to it.
Thank you, Will. And to the 289 folks whose questions we were unable to answer during this short time, thank you for your patience. That's all we have. Colin, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity, and I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you, Will.
Yeah, thank you all. This was really terrific.
Thank you, Will and Sadia, for your insights this evening, day, morning, wherever you may be tuning in from. And thanks to our audience for all of your great questions. I promise we got to as many of them as we could. All of us at UChicago alumni wish to share our heartfelt thanks to those on the front lines of the pandemic, from healthcare workers and first responders to grocery store workers and essential employees here in Chicago and across the globe. Thank you. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the University of Chicago community has stepped up and stepped forward to help those impacted by the crisis. So far, we've given emergency financial support to over 1,600 undergraduate, graduate, and professional students. We've donated over 100,000 meals to those in our neighborhood on the Chicago South Side. And we've collected and distributed over 800,000 pieces of PPE. Today, more than ever, the University of Chicago community gains strength by working together. To learn more about how the University of Chicago is combating COVID-19 and helping those impacted by the crisis, please follow this link on your screen to learn more. I hope you'll join us on Tuesday, May 26th at 6:30 p.m. Chicago time for our next virtual Harper lecture featuring Nicholas Epley, Professor of Behavioral Science and Director of the Center for Decision Research at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business for his talk, Designing a Good Life. Until then, I'm Colin Hennessy, wishing you all good health and well-being. Thank you for joining us. You may now disconnect.